I don't think anyone could quarrel with the assertion that in this century the two most influential philosophers in the English-speaking world have been Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. Russell, besides being a great philosopher, was a tremendous public figure. Immersed in political and social affairs nearly all his life, he became exceedingly familiar to the general public as a broadcaster and journalist and social critic, so people came to associate him quite rightly with certain general ideas and with a particular approach to social problems, even if they didn't know much about his philosophy, the best of which in any case was highly mathematical and technical, and therefore not really accessible to the non-specialist. Wittgenstein was quite different. He was only a technical philosopher. He took no part in public activity, shunned exposure even within his own profession, published very little. The result of this is that for a long time his influence, though immense, was confined to full-time students of philosophy. Only comparatively recently has this influence begun to seep out into surrounding areas of thought and affect people in other fields of activity. So the situation now is that a very large number of people have heard of Wittgenstein who don't really have any idea at all of what he did or why it's important. In this programme we're going to try and rectify that a bit, and as far as is possible in the short space of a single programme, to bring out clearly the main lines of Wittgenstein's thought and say something about what its influence has been outside as well as inside philosophy. This not easy task is being taken on by Anthony Quinton, Fellow of New College, Oxford, where he's been teaching philosophy now for over 20 years. Mr. Quinton is currently also writing a history of philosophy in which Wittgenstein will be treated at some considerable length. But before I invite Anthony Quinton to start talking about Wittgenstein's ideas, I'd like myself, if I may, to say something about Wittgenstein the man. He was born in Vienna in 1889 and died in Cambridge in 1951, having incidentally become a British subject in his middle age. His father was the richest and most powerful steel magnate in Austria, and as a young child Wittgenstein developed a passionate interest in machinery, which was to set the pattern for his whole education. His parents sent him to a school that specialized in mathematics and the physical sciences, and he went on from there to become a student in mechanical engineering. At the age of 19, he came to Britain as a research student in engineering at Manchester University, and it was while he was there that he became fascinated by what were in fact philosophical questions about the foundations of the mathematics he was using. He read Bertrand Russell's great book, The Principles of Mathematics, and this seems to have been a kind of revelation to him. He threw up engineering and went to Cambridge to study logic under Russell. And within a very short time indeed he was producing original work of his own, which many people have regarded from that day to this as work of genius. It resulted in the only book of his to be published during his lifetime, a book with the somewhat off-putting title Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, usually referred to by philosophers simply as the Tractatus. It was published in Austria in 1929 and in England in 1920. It was published in Austria in 1921 and in England in 1922. It's very short, but certainly one of the most influential works of philosophy to be published in this century. However, while it was exerting this tremendous influence over subsequent years, Wittgenstein himself was becoming more and more discontented with it. In fact, he came to the view that it was fundamentally mistaken, and he produced a whole new philosophy which repudiated his earlier one. During his lifetime, this second philosophy was disseminated only to and through his students at Cambridge, but after his death a whole mass of writings came out which embodied it too. The most important of these was a book called Philosophical Investigations, which was published in 1953, and which then proceeded to have as great an influence as the Tractatus had had 30 years before. This is a unique phenomenon in the whole history of philosophy, a philosopher of genius producing two different and incompatible philosophies, each of which decisively influenced a whole generation. Well, now we must go back to the beginning and follow this story through in terms of the ideas involved. First, the Tractatus, then, produced during the second decade of this century. Anthony Quinton, it's a very short book. It's less than 80 pages in the standard edition. What would you say are the central problems that Wittgenstein was trying to solve in it?
I think the shortest way of stating the central problem of the book is as follows. How is language possible? People had assumed, made all sorts of assumptions about meaning previously, how people attach meaning to words, Wittgenstein immensely generalized the question and said, how in general is it possible for human beings, by producing marks on paper or making noises, to represent something that was utterly different in character from the marks and noises used to represent them?
I think many of the people watching this programme might not see at once why that is a problem. People are inclined to take language for granted. Why should the very existence of language present a philosophical problem?
Well, if one looks at the world in a more or less statistical way, in a great deal of it, things interact causally with each other, rocks bang against rocks, moons influence tides, and so on. But just here and there in the world is this extraordinary phenomenon of some elements in the world intelligently reproducing other elements of it in themselves. I agree, of course, it's the texture of our whole inner lives, the use of language, the understanding of language, our communication with our fellow men, of course, principally, though not exclusively, takes place through it. I think it's just one of those questions that seems so obvious that most people don't bother to ask it, rather like Newton asking seriously why the planets didn't charge off in all directions, why stones dropped when released from the hand. It's got the same naive, pristine fundamentalness.
In other words, we have this ability to think about and therefore handle, in a sense, things which are not present to us. And this is made possible by language, or partly made possible by language. And this raises two sets of questions. What is the relationship of language to the world? And what is the relationship of language to thought? And I take you to agree that both of these questions are central to what the Tractatus is trying to do.
Yes, people had asked questions about these things, as it were, in a piecemeal way before. The great fascination of the Tractatus is they're asked with the utmost conceivable generality. And to both of the things you mentioned, he has answers to give. There's this apparently not very helpful answer at first glance, that language represents the world by depicting it. Propositions are pictures, he says, of facts. And equally, propositions are expressions of thought. They're the vehicles of thought. They're what we think with.
Now, there's another side to this coin, isn't there, that he was also concerned with. The very fact that he was concerned with the limits of what could be expressed in language and discovering what the limits were to what language could do meant that he was also concerned with what language can't do.
This was a very essential feature of the whole operation, and perhaps in some ways one of those that's had the largest possible influence, his insistence that the limits of language were clearly stateable. And all this followed from his idea that language is essentially, and I have to insist, literally, pictorial in character. There's a well-known anecdote about Wittgenstein hearing of the use of some models in a French law court, I think it was, to represent the state of affairs in some street accident. And he had, confronted with this, the sort of experience that Archimedes cried Eureka about. This is it, I've got it. He said, that is the essence of language. And this put very serious constraints on language, that language had exactly to mirror states of affairs in which objects were engaged. And so this put limits to of a very marked kind on what could be said in his view. In particular, he thought that the relation of language to the world itself couldn't be meaningfully represented in language or discussed in language.